Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on what's going on with supply chain and logistics in the age of coronavirus. My name is Julian Luthold, and I'm the founder and CEO of Get Global, which is the premier summit on international expansion and strategy. We are in Long Beach every autumn, and Long Beach has been a tremendous partner, and the Port of Long Beach has been a leader in that space for us. And Weston Labar, who's also joining us, has also been a very valuable partner. I must say that Long Beach has been a very welcoming place. And I wish that we had the opportunity to be doing meetings down there, because it's a wonderful place to do meetings and see people, but such is the time we're living in. So I didn't want to spend too much time introducing ourselves. I hope that you'll find out more about what we do if you haven't already known about us. It's a great place to meet folks and get a wider view on what's going on internationally. But today we're going to focus on specifically what's going on with supply chain and logistics related issues. And we will start with introducing Dr. Noel Asagaba. He is the Deputy Executive Director of the Port of Long Beach and its Chief Operating Officer. And Weston Labar is the CEO of the Harbor Trucking Association and the President and CEO of Ventures 52, and also the founder, right, of Pair Strategies? Yes, Correctamundo. So without any further ado, the format for today is that I'm going to turn over to Dr. Asagaba and Mr. Labar for a few brief comments about what they're seeing, top of mind, high level issues. And then we're going to start diving into some of the tricky issues that I think a lot of you folks are facing. To remind everybody, we have a discussion going on Slack. We've had a little bit of feedback so far that not familiar with how the Slack and Zoom interplay works. Slack is wonderful for having a discussion online. It allows the discussion to live on afterwards, whereas with Zoom it would not. And you can pose questions, make comments as the whole video conference today is unfolding, and we can come back to that, and I can sort of use your comments and questions to fuel the discussion from here before we turn it over to Q&A with all of you. For those of you who are not on Slack and are adamant about not getting into it, which there's a few out there, I'm sure, feel free to use the Q&A prompt in the Zoom interface here. There's, it's right at the bottom, and I'll see both, okay? So, Noel, how are you doing today? And please do tell us a little bit about what you're seeing from your eagle's nest.
Well, Julian, first of all, thank you to you and Get Global for arranging this forum. As you can imagine, here at the Port of Long Beach, we've been doing a number of these, as I'm sure my good friend and colleague, Weston Labar. But we think it's critical that we communicate as often as possible to ensure that everyone knows that the Port of Long Beach, the San Pedro Bay, is open, it's operating, and it is an essential service that will not be shut down. And so I think as a starting point, I just want to make sure that everyone on the line knows that, and we will continue to advocate strongly for the supply chain to be continue to move forward as an essential service. How are we? Well, what I thought would be of interest to the listeners here is to give you a very high-level update on what's happening on the ground. And I put together a few slides, and hopefully, if we manage the technology here properly, can you all see that? Q1, container volume?
Yeah, we do.
All right, fantastic. So let me start here, because a lot of folks are asking us what is going on at the ports. And just to put this in a context, last year, 2019, and Q4 of 2018, we were all dealing with and trying to manage as best possible the trade war between the US and China. And when the agreements started materializing, and the phase one deal was signed in January, we were all very hopeful and optimistic that the tide was turning and that the volumes that we saw slow down significantly in 2019 were going to rebound. And so there was a lot of hope and optimism, and we here in Southern California were preparing ourselves for a surge, working along with our partners like Weston at HTA. And little did we know that this coronavirus that began in China would have a two-pronged impact on our volumes. And so I say that because when the coronavirus started spreading across China and Asia, the effect it had there was on supply. And when the Chinese factories did not reopen following Lunar New Year, and the transportation system, the supply chain in China was effectively shut down because of the virus, we started seeing the effects immediately. In fact, if you look at our container volumes here on the screen, you'll see that for the first quarter of 2020, we're down about 7 points. Now, that may not seem like a lot given some of the other figures you're seeing from other ports and gateways, but 2018, the same period we're comparing the first quarter of this year with, was already a slow year because at the end of 2018, a lot of shippers advanced their orders trying to get ahead of the tariffs. So minus 7% on top of what was then a minus double-digit decline, I think reveals just how, the magnitude of the impact. So that was on the supply side. And you see this illustrated as well in the blank sailings. Now, for those on the line that are not familiar with a blank sailing is effectively a ship that was scheduled to call here in our port that was canceled. It was removed from the rotation. So that means we have fewer ships. With fewer ships, we have fewer containers, less volume. And as you can see there, for the first quarter 2020, between the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, we had 61 blank sailings. Now, 61 as a percentage of the total number of vessel calls per year may not seem like a lot, but for this time of year, 61 is effectively twice the number of blank sailings we're accustomed to seeing following Chinese New Year. And again, this is all being reflected in our volumes. What's more concerning to us now is this gets us to the second round of the impact of coronavirus. So as the virus spread across Asia, it spread to Europe, it spread to the United States. With the situation here in the U.S. and how we, at all levels of government, are dealing with the virus to protect human health, the shutdown, the national shutdown, has now impacted demand. And with shippers unable to fulfill orders because either stores have been closed or hours have been reduced, and a lot of the inventory that did make its way here from Asia is now being stored away until we recover from this situation here. We're now beginning to see the blank sailings in the second quarter to inch up. In fact, based on the latest data, we're up to 30 for the second quarter. And again, 30 is about twice the number we see in a typical year for this time of year. So we're bracing ourselves for what we believe is going to be a slow second quarter. We will see a bit of a surge in April, and that's all the volume that started making its way here from China when factories started reopening and the supply chain there resumed operations. But we do think that second quarter is going to be slow again. And so this brings me to the projections, and I think everyone on the line would be interested in seeing this because this guides how the supply chain, it manages a situation here in Southern California. But as you can see, based on the data that we have available today, we're looking at a second quarter that's going to be 14% slower than the same period last year. And this is consistent with what we're seeing in other gateways, other ports, Port of Los Angeles primarily. But it's going to be a slow quarter. We're going to see a bit of a surge. It's going to be muted. But again, the inching up of blank sailings in the months of May and June are going to hold our volumes down. Having said that, we remain very optimistic that our economy here in the U.S. has proven to be resilient over the course of history. And with the aggressive measures that our leaders in government are taking at all levels of government, we're optimistic that the economy will rebound, the supply chain will rebound, and that things will continue to hum along. I can assure everyone here that we're going to continue to do everything within our power to make sure that the port remains open, that the terminals remain operating, and that includes protecting the health of our dock workers, of our truck drivers, all of our supply chain partners. We're doing, working around the clock to ensure that we have the contingency plans, we have the protocols, we have the lines of communication with all the proper agencies at the federal, county, and local levels to ensure that if there is an incident, that it's managed immediately and with the end of keeping the ports operational. I'm going to flip a few slides forward because I certainly want to give my colleague Weston an opportunity to weigh in on this as well. And I'm going to take you all to this slide because one of the questions we get, Julian, is, so what is the Port of Long Beach doing to aid in the recovery and help support the port and the supply chain? Well, we established a business recovery task force that I have the pleasure of leading. It's a multi-divisional, multifunctional team internal to the Port of Long Beach. And this is what we do on a day-to-day basis. We gather and report critical business information. We think this is our duty and our responsibility as a port authority is to disseminate critical information to all of our supply chain partners so that they can make real-time decisions about their businesses. Everything from reporting gate hours, vessel calls, blank sailings, any piece of information, any data that may be essential for them to be able to make decisions, plan their operations, plan their labor. We believe it's critical to report that as quickly as possible. And in this era of fake news, we think it's also vital that we dispel any rumors, any falsehoods, and any gossip about what may or may not be happening around the complex. And so we truly view ourselves as a repository of information, disseminator of information that's critical so that our partners can make good decisions. Of course, we also anticipate and address operational issues. The biggest operational issue we just dealt with in the last 6 weeks is how to handle the long line of empty containers and outbound containers that were lining up. And the source of that was, believe it or not, was the blank sailings, the 61 blank sailings that impacted LA Long Beach. But the reason why Long Beach in particular was impacted is because there was a disparity between the blank sailings. There were 19 blank sailings that affected the Long Beach side, but there were 42 blank sailings that affected the Los Angeles side. So in the absence of all those 42 vessel calls not coming in at Los Angeles terminals, after all, the ocean carriers directed all the empties and outbound containers to Long Beach terminals. And that created some congestion for a period of time, but we've since recovered from that. Our terminals stepped up and they ensured that they were opening gates and optimize their operations in their yards. And more importantly, we partnered with our ocean carrier partners and they've started sending a series of ultra large vessels to our port with the priority to reposition and evacuate these empties. So for example, right now at the Port of Long Beach at TTI, we have a 23,000 TEU MIA from MSC. And they didn't come fully laden, but they were here to evacuate as many empties and outbound containers as possible. Thirdly, this task force engages and we mobilize our supply chain partners. And again, this is all in an effort to ensure that we're all seeing the same things and we're all planning for the same forecasts. And for instance, we shared the data on blank sailings with HTA. They've taken the leadership to collect and to help us disseminate that information. Fourthly, we're also working with our terminal operators and our shippers to expedite containers that carry any type of COVID-19 related supplies. So that includes everything from PPE like N95 masks, gloves, gowns, to cleaning supplies, supplies that are necessary for sanitizing workplace, et cetera. And so far, it's been very successful. A lot of our shippers in the health industry space are very grateful to us for helping to facilitate that. And finally, Julian, as part of our recovery task force, we're also advocating for ports and goods movement. And as I mentioned, when we started seeing levels of government issue orders, stay-at-home orders, we knew right away that we had to be part of that discussion, be at the table, advocate, influence to ensure that ports and the end-to-end supply chain were exempted from that. And so far, that's been the case. So I'll end my comments here. I mean, obviously, I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, but I thought these were the salient points that those on the line might be interested in hearing.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. How about yourself, Weston? What are you seeing from where you are right now, which looks like a pretty cool place?
Yeah, I'm coming to you straight from my local pub, which is inside my house, the only place open these days. Anyway, I just want to say thank you for having me on board. The Harbor Trucking Association obviously has tried to be very engaged in what's going on, both to first and foremost protect our workforce, make sure that they have access to the necessary PPE, and to make sure that they're being safe, and we're working with the marine terminals to have safe working conditions, which I just want to say thank you to all the marine terminals and the ports on the West Coast. They've done a fantastic job stepping up and working with us on protocols to keep workers safe. But this has been a challenging situation for our members. As Noel pointed out, we saw a first phase of this when we saw manufacturing shut down in China. And many of our members saw declines in business as much as 60 to 70% for a 3-week period. This year has definitely been a down year for many of our members. And I think they've done a tremendous job of keeping trucks moving and keeping folks under contract during these times to make sure that we don't see the drastic economic impacts that other industries have seen. And obviously we saw a nice uptick as China got back online, as we saw manufacturing pick up. But as Noel said, now we're headed into the second phase of this, which to me is much more concerning, which is the lack of consumer spending ability on the American side, because one, we have the stay-at-home orders, but we're seeing unprecedented unemployment as a result of coronavirus. So we're getting ready for a very tough May for sure, and end of April. We've already started working with our members to make sure that they have contingency plans in place, because the first time around, many of our members were able to find for them what would be non-traditional work. If they didn't have work at the port, perhaps they could get some work at a rail terminal as opposed to a marine terminal, and that at least that keeps the truck moving and is able to defray cost. But I think the scary thing about this whole process is the uncertainty. And I think Noel would agree that right now we're in phase 1 of the coronavirus impacts to the United States. And once we get past the health impact issue, then we have the monumental task of restarting the economy. And we don't know how much that's going to take until we get through the first part of this, which is making sure that we flatten the curve and making sure we get through the impacts of the pandemic itself. And then we'll start to assess, where are we with unemployment? How quickly can some of these folks get back to work? And if you talk to many economists, this could be a 2-year plus process for many industries in some regions of the country. So I think what we've looked at as our role through this process is, first and foremost, like I said, is making sure that we're protecting the health and safety of our workforce, working with marine terminals, working with the PMA and the ILW on processes as it relates to in-gating and out-gating at a terminal, making sure that they have proper access to supplies, which you would be surprised is not easy. But by the end of next week, we'll have dispersed some 2,000 masks to drivers, gloves to drivers, and we're waiting on some shipments of hand sanitizer that we'll be able to distribute as well. And on top of that, we've been able to put our companies in touch with the types of suppliers so they can get access as well. I guess we're the national stockpile for the local trucking industry, but we have supplies in our stockpile, which is a good thing. And then beyond that, I think is we're looking at the potential impacts and making sure our members are prepared of an economic downturn, whether that be short-term or long-term. You still want to make sure that that people are prepared and advocating on the issues necessary to protect our members. I think one of the things that people don't understand is how codependent the supply chain is. And a great example of that was a couple weeks ago when we saw the blank sailings coming in March. The marine terminals shut down because they didn't have the proper revenue coming in because they didn't have any imports, which meant that empties got stuck out in the supply chain in truckers' yards, at distribution centers. And you get a whole host of issues, whether it be disputes on fees, which could total millions of dollars for a beneficial cargo owner or a trucking company, the administrative process of disputing all that, obviously the cost for a marine terminal if they open up to take back empties, which many of them did, despite having no income because they're not moving laden containers. And you know, the impacts in totality are very difficult because when you get these imbalances, you get the ebbs and flows of the industry, and instead of being efficient, which I think everybody in this industry would agree that you want to be able to have a container in and a container out, or what we call a dual transaction. And when you have an imbalance, everything's a single transaction. So you're throwing a lot more truck power at moving less containers. And that's not a good thing environmentally, from an operational efficiency standpoint. So we're hoping that through this, we're going to be better prepared for the second part of this. And we really need to be prepared when a surge does come, when we start to see the economic rebound domestically. But I think the good news is that everybody that I've spoken to throughout the supply chain has stepped up. Sometimes you need to pressure folks a little bit more or help educate them on your point of view and then share that opportunity to understand where they're coming from. But I think by and large, we've all tried to step up and work together to minimize the impacts, to understand that these are tough times and to make sure that not only are workers safe and healthy, but you know, we're working with technology companies on free applications, for instance, for street turns on empties. You know, I probably can't say who at this point in time, but the information will come out in short order. Working with marine terminals on improvements to appointment systems to get those empties back in a more fluid manner. In general, just trying to figure out how do we improve the process and, you know, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think one of the issues that we have as a supply chain is, when things go bad, they go really bad, and we talk about how to fix them, but we don't always fix them. Just things get back to normalcy. And these types of situations expose where the weak links of the supply chain are. And now it's time to go in and reinforce them and make sure that they are not the weak links next time.
So to give a sense of who's on the line today for my next question, and thank you for that, Weston, that was really great. What would you say are the kinds of, so all right, so to give a sense of the audience, we've got folks in the shipping and transportation industries. We've got folks who are BCOs, a couple of folks in foreign governments and in foreign territories who either import to or export from the United States. So what kinds of, like if you had to grade the, you know, door-to-door health and safety processes, what would you give that grade? What kinds of precautions should everyone be taking to ensure that by the time something gets to a consumer or it gets onto a factory floor, that everything is looking great, that the truckers are safe, that the folks at the port are safe? So not just what's going on in the containers, but everything inside. A little bit of high-level analysis. What do you think, Weston?
Well, there's a couple things I'd point out. First and foremost, you need to have processes in place for the folks that are handling that cargo. So the longshoremen and the truckers and the warehouse workers, that allows for social distancing. That's been one of the big things that we've pushed, is how do you digitize the supply chain? Why are we in a situation where we're handing paperwork from one person to a next? You know, make sure that we have API integrations between terminals and truckers, and that we're doing as much as we can without paperwork. That's the first thing, is maintaining social distancing policies. Secondly, Again, hats off to the terminal. Every terminal on the West Coast now is phone free, meaning that there's no, what you would think of as a payphone call box to go up to. Everybody has functioning speakers or kiosks that again allows them to maintain social distancing and decreases touch points. Obviously, anybody who touches cargo, the packaging inside the containers that handles the trucks, et cetera. We want everybody to be wearing PPE at this point in time. It's not only paramount for personal safety, but it helps make sure that there's no contamination of packages. I would definitely recommend, and most warehousing and distribution centers are doing this, and they're wiping down packages before they're delivered. But anybody who receives a package in their home or at their store should have folks on site to sanitize them by wiping them down with any sort of cleaning products like Clorox or something else, just to make sure that that they feel safe, that nothing was contaminated between the previous point of touch and their point of touch. But I think it's a team effort, and if everybody does their part and they try to minimize their exposure to the virus, and then they try to minimize the ability for them to spread it elsewhere, again using masks and gloves, and then wiping things down, that ensures the safety of the folks that are getting the final packages, and make sure that everybody throughout that supply chain is safe.
What do you think, Noel?
I agree with Weston's assessment. I mean, we here at the Port of Long Beach have been very encouraged by all of our supply chain partners stepping up and doing their part. The supply chain by its very nature is very interdependent, interconnected. And if all of us do our part as we touch the container when it crosses our desk, if you will, our operation, that's what will ensure that we mitigate any risk of exposure. And as Weston said, every one of our terminals here at the port are practicing social distancing. They're going above and beyond this, in some cases, what the CDC and other public health agencies are advising. One of the other things that the ports are doing here in Southern California that Weston referenced is we're doing everything possible to facilitate access to a lot of this PPE and supplies that are needed. In fact, one of the things that our terminals did is they've instituted an extra hour. They basically deferred the beginning of the second shift just to give the employees the opportunity to clean, sanitize, decontaminate the facilities and the equipment that is being used by our dock workers. And that has been extremely valuable, because at the end of the day, when something like this happens, the biggest priority is the health and safety of our workers. And again, we've seen nothing short or less of everyone stepping up and doing their part.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I just want to add, I think the other thing, and this goes for anybody, we have a policy right now. If you see something, say something. We work very hard with the various organizations that represent the terminals, PMA, PMSA, WICM, TOA, to help create suggested best practices as it relates to truckers interacting with terminals and how to best conduct business. And what we've had is a policy where I literally get text messages and social media outreach from truck drivers, and they'll say, hey, this happened, it doesn't seem right. And then we'll reach out to terminal management, because there's so many people that could be on dock, and some of them may not be regular. They'd be what would be called a casual longshoreman. So processes and procedures change from terminal to terminal. So sometimes it's as simple as if something happens that you feel uncomfortable with, say something, and then you're able to relay that to management to say, hey, this is what happened tonight. Is this part of your policy? And maybe they'll say, oh, no, that's not what we want the drivers to do. And we'll reach back out to our partners, the longshoremen, and just reiterate what our process is during COVID-19. So, I think that's part of it, is just continuously making sure that the best practices and the policies, procedures that are put in place to protect the workers. Then if the workers have a feeling of being uncomfortable or feeling that something is maybe not working the way that we thought it would from a high level, to say something back to us so we can tweak it to make sure that we are keeping their health and safety first and foremost paramount on these issues.
So what do you suspect the medium to long term to look like? Assuming we can flatten the curve in a reasonable amount of time, and by this I mean, before summer sets in, there's talk of second spikes, or what have you. I mean, all of that is tremendously uncertain, and it's impossible to keep an economy down for too long. What would be the effects on port traffic and ground transportation when volume bounces back? And I've got a follow-up question to this for you, Weston. Noel, if you wouldn't mind taking that first.
Sure. Well, I'm an optimist at heart, right? And I really believe that the U.S. economy is resilient, and all the aggressive measures that are unprecedented in themselves in response to this unprecedented crisis, I think is laying the groundwork for a recovery that I hope is coming soon and immediate. And I know Congress right now is in the process of providing additional funding to prepare the economy for that rebound. Again, the numbers are scary. I grant that. But I think when we all believe in the resiliency of the economy, and we come out of the shelter-in-place orders, and we go back to spending and buying and purchasing and taking out loans, I mean, all that individual activity collectively is what's going to stand up our economy again. So having said that, I believe demand in the U.S. is still strong. In fact, even though we as consumers are unable to go to stores as frequently as we used to, our phone calls with high-level executives at some of the biggest retailers are telling us that online shopping and e-commerce is through the roof. And so even though we're not physically going to stores and experiencing the discovery of touching things and seeing things, people continue to buy, they continue to consume. And I'm hopeful that that will continue, because it's that demand, Julian, that's going to support and sustain the supply chain. The blank sailings we're seeing in Q2, I think, speaks to the weakening demand. But hopefully, once we get past the immediate impact of this virus on the health and welfare of our citizens, we'll go back to some of those same routines and rhythms, and that's what's going to prop up the economy again. And then going back to the phase one trade deal, keep in mind that that deal opened the door for billions of dollars in exports. And so I'm hopeful that once we get past this health impact, that we can go back to prioritizing sending goods out. And again, in connection with the U.S. economy being resilient and rebounding, we'll have a healthy balance for a stronger supply chain. So with all that in mind, I suspect that the third quarter, probably the mid to latter part of the third quarter, is when we're going to start seeing some of the numbers that we're accustomed to seeing. But second quarter, again, doesn't look very pretty, but I'm hopeful that by the time we get to the third quarter, things will start rebounding.
Yeah, and you touched on something that I've been hopping up and down, yelling into the abyss, which is that I really hope that folks in Congress treat this like a demand problem that then became a supply problem, rather than the reverse, because otherwise I think folks will miss half the economy or more. But that's me editorializing. So Weston, how would you answer that question? What do you expect to see in the medium to long term? Like I said, I've got a follow-up question to this, but what are your perceptions and thoughts on how the industry will respond to a bounce back to normalcy?
Yeah, so I think the good thing is due to technology, we've softened the overall blow of the pandemic, right? So many folks who are not essential businesses can continue to conduct business virtually, as long as the type of business they are in allows for it. As Noel mentioned, e-commerce has allowed people to continue to procure goods, both essential and non-essential, without leaving their home. And that's good that we see still a certain level of consumer activity. I think the scariest thing is the uncertainty, and the longer the efforts to control the spread stay in place, which I agree with and I think are paramount, but the harder the recovery is going to be. And I sit as vice chair as our workforce board here for the city of Long Beach, and we oversee both of the harbors, LA and Long Beach. And if you look at the data, it's scary. Over the last 3 weeks, 17 million Americans roughly have applied for unemployment benefits. That's a record. We have right now record unemployment that we're seeing as a result of this in certain areas. And I think that the difficulty is going to be, again, we won't know what the recovery looks like until we get through this initial phase. Now, the hope is that we get through this soon, and as Noel will tell you, back to school shopping is a big boon for the ports and is a great way to get global shipping up. And should we see a return to somewhat of a normal lifestyle in, let's say, late June or early July, even, we'll be able to be set up for back to school shopping. I think that the bigger thing on the global supply chain and the vitality of the ports, not just here, but throughout the country, are really going to depend on how quickly people get back to work. And I think that's, again, the scary thing is for every week that we are shut down, folks that were previously just temporarily furloughed could move to being laid off and unemployed. So again, it's a supply and a demand issue. And as you put it, Julian, if we can keep demand up, we'll have to create the supply to fulfill that. And I think that what's happening with the stimulus packages is definitely going to soften those blows, but we know they're going to be oversubscribed. And I think we're going to need more aid if this continues to be a situation that we deal with much longer. So I'm optimistic, as is Noel, but I think that it's hard for me to come up with something that I feel very confident about right now, just because we don't have a line of sight to when we will stop the current shelter-in-place activities, and that's going to be completely dependent, in my opinion, on what the recovery looks like. But that being said, we need to, as a supply chain, be ready to handle a surge immediately because, as I said, depending on how the chips fall, it could be in the middle of back to school, which you're going to need folks to have the proper equipment for their education, outfits and whatnot as they go back to school. As we all know, kids grow very quickly, and that should help get some economic stimulus going, and then hopefully some folks get back to work and we can just continue to build upon that.
And then of course the holidays, right?
Yeah.
So quick follow-up question. We've got 20 minutes left and I want to be sure to turn out to questions. And folks, I just left a message in Slack to put your questions there. I'll get to those. And Joe, I saw your questions here. So you mentioned the hit to business that this has had in the beginning of this call. What do you sense in the financial footing of the trucking industry in general and its upstream and downstream partners that would keep key elements, entities from consolidating or experiencing trouble? And do you see the federal government paying attention to that sufficiently?
Wow, that's a big question. So I would say,
I know I prefaced it. I think mostly what I'm looking for is an emotional response, but answer as you will. I thought you'd have an interesting view on that.
I think from our standpoint, the best thing we can do is to continue to move goods. If wheels are turning, people are being paid. And from our standpoint, we've tried to just minimize economic impacts to our frontline workers and to the workforce as a whole. I think we've been fortunate in the sense that we have been an essential industry. And thus far, we've got folks that are dealing with this and very amicably despite all the challenges. Now, like I said, I think the longer this goes, if consumer demand drops, that's where the real concerns are going to be. And unfortunately, we're at least getting our folks in touch with the proper resources that the federal government has put out, the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection that's available, the SBA loans. As you know, we have an industry that's filled with small businesses, with independent contractors, with employees. So making sure we get the right type of resources to the right type of people is very important. But I think that what the federal government has done thus far has definitely been helpful to the economy as a whole. I don't know how many in our industry have taken advantage of it because, quite frankly, the goal has been to continue to push through this and continue to move cargo. I think the concern will be if there's no cargo to move, what happens if these oversubscribed programs don't have resources left in them at a time when the transportation industry, which is essential to our economy, may need some assistance. And the hope is at that point in time, federal government would come back if necessary and create some sort of specialized package for the transportation and supply chain industries. But the hope is we don't get there. And that's where I'm trying to share Noel's optimism. And I do, in the sense that if we just keep working, we keep getting things moving, then we will have less of a need for any sort of a stimulus package. But I'd like to know that it's there, obviously, for our industry, should it be necessary. And hopefully there'll be a minimal number of folks that need that. This may, at the back end, you may see a lot of consolidation. We already see consolidation in this industry. And we were seeing it prior to the economic downturn as a result of the coronavirus. We saw some major mergers that were announced. And I think coming out of this, it may just be an opportunity for some folks to maybe buy on the cheap, if you will. But I think you're going to continue to see consolidation no matter what. And on the back end of it, it may actually slow down consolidation as people are looking at whether companies are well positioned to come out of a potential economic hardship. But again, the hope is that doesn't happen. But I know that we've got great partners like the ports and other supply chain members. Should transportation supply chain industry need a specific legislative fix to help with economic stimulus, I think we've demonstrated that truckers move the American economy, and ports and truckers and the various stakeholders that keep goods moving are paramount to the success of this nation. And we need to do whatever we can to make sure that they're healthy, both physically and economically.
So we've got some congressional staffers who deal with some of these issues on the line today. Is there anything that you'd like to add? I think that was really helpful information for them, but is there anything on top of that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just say that anything that does happen, I think it's important to work directly with the trucking industry because we have so many different verticals of trucking. So what benefits an over-the-road carrier doing long hauls much different than what a port drayman or a rail intermodal carrier might need. And so I think it's important to make sure that policymakers are working directly with industry so that legislation would be crafted in a way where it really does help the industry. I think too many times, and I understand the reasons we generalize when it comes to legislation, and a lot of times port truckers don't see the same sort of benefits when some of these grant programs or public assistance programs come out. So I would just ask that we take into consideration that we don't have a one-size-fits-all industry, and we need to just make sure that we're creating a protective net for as many folks as possible.
Agreed. Noel, I'm curious about the same kind of question to you, which would be, what are you seeing in the global shipping industry? A lot of those companies are foreign and therefore not subject to federal support in the same way. What should folks on the line be ready to look at and experience as things get closer? And I just want to mention really quickly that we've only got about 15 minutes left, but we also don't have a ton of questions. It's a remarkably quiet crowd for the size. We've got a lot of people on the line today, but what do you think, Noel?
Well, first of all, for those staffers from Congress that are on the line, thank you. I mean, thank you for your support. As I've been saying, the aggressive measures Congress is taking, I think, are going to be critical for the eventual economic recovery for our country, and including our supply chain. And I would also echo what Weston said. You know, when we try to address and facilitate trade, supply chain, it's important that we have the bigger picture in mind, right? And that's what we've been advocating for at all levels of government. It's not just the ports, but it's the entire end-to-end supply chain. And I'll use that, Julian, sort of as a stepping stone or a segue to answer your question, because this 1-2 punch of the trade war, immediately followed up by this coronavirus with a very short window of respite, I think it is going to trigger for many U.S.-based shippers to hedge their bets. I mean, we've been talking and we've been seeing the trends for some time now about the shift in manufacturing from China to Southeast Asia. And the trade war certainly, in our opinion, accelerated that. this coronavirus, I think, exacerbated that. And we're seeing now, increasingly U.S.-based businesses repatriating some of their manufacturing operations to the U.S. or closer to the U.S., i.e. Mexico, Canada. And I think that what this pandemic immediately following on this trade war has taught us all is just how much risk and exposure there is. And so I believe that a lot of shippers, a lot of U.S.-based businesses are going to be reevaluating their strategies. They're going to be reevaluating how they source their products. They're going to be reevaluating, the risks that's involved in all of this. I don't believe it's going to happen at a wholesale basis. I don't believe it's going to change overnight, but I think it's definitely going to incentivize a lot of U.S.-based businesses to start hedging their bets.
From the ears that we have out in Southeast Asia, it sounds like there's been a lot of effort to figure out how to unwind and any issues with supply chain matters. There seems to have been a lot of help from the United States and the binational business organizations, one of which is our partner, the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Let's hope that all works out well. Now and thank you for that, Noel. I'm going to turn over to a question from the representative from New South Wales, Australia. New South Wales is one of our founding partners as of about a week ago. Thank you. He represents small Australian exporters, and he's asking, what are you seeing in regard from traffic from Australia to the US, and what about air freight, UPS, FedEx, DHL, who's impacted, and how should folks be thinking about how to navigate that?
Well, first of all, welcome to the Get Global community. Fantastic to have someone from New South Wales. Up until a couple of years ago, the Port of Long Beach actually had a trade representative based here in Australia. Now, obviously, given our geography, our location, the vast majority of our business is with Asia, principally China, but we do get some business from Australia. In terms of percentage, it's probably, I would guess, based on the cargo flows and containers, probably about 0.2% is what I would imagine. Nonetheless, we do get cargo from Australia. We appreciate that. To answer your question more broadly, the effect that this virus has had on the modes of transportation is, especially when it comes to COVID-19 related supplies and such as PPE, masks, gloves, etc. A lot of that is now being brought in via air freight, right? Why? Because it's much faster, and a lot of these goods these days are high value. And so we are seeing that shift. We believe it's going to be temporary. I mean, obviously, this is an urgent situation that requires, the fast transport of these goods. But going forward, we don't believe that the 90-10 split between water, ocean going, and air is gonna change much going forward. I think once we come out of this situation in recovery phase, I think you're going to continue to see the vast majority of goods transported via water. Why? Because it's just cheaper. It's economics, economies of scale, especially in recent years as ships have upsized. They're enjoying the economies of scale as the shipping lines themselves have consolidated under alliance partners. That also has contributed to an optimization in that segment. So I think that water transportation will continue to be the dominant form of transport for all gateways in all regions in the world.
Yeah, Julian, I agree 100% with Noel. Air freight's a very expensive insurance policy when you need to get critical supply someplace where there's a critical demand for it, right? So, and typically it may be a retailer or an importer that just there's a blank sailing that rolls it, and so they move to air freight to do a stopgap or something. And in this situation, again, it's the fact that we have imperative and critical equipment that needs to get to places before we see a lack of equipment to maintain people's health and well-being. But we'll get back to normalcy. And I think that the majority of goods that are flowing that aren't what you would call critical from a medical standpoint, the ventilators and the hospital equipment, it's coming via ship anyway. So I think that as things get normal, you'll see that normal balance come back. I think the bigger concern for the folks of us in this industry is just it's what harbors will the ships come to. And I think that's the tough thing that we're all competing for throughout not just the nation, but North America. We compete with ports from Canada and from Mexico and from the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And as we get through this, I think there's two things that are paramount. One is we need to show the world that we're working together to maintain as fluid of supply chain that comes through America's West Coast ports as possible, and that we've come out of this stronger, and that on the tail end of this, we'll be in a better situation and more prepared to have an optimized supply chain. And I do think that will be the result, because there's many things that have been on folks' roadmaps or have been discussed as concepts in the past that people are working on and they're deploying and we're improving upon. So I am an optimist that 2 or 3 years from now, we'll have reemerged as the gateway that you need to send your cargo through. But we have an opportunity right now to show folks that we are prepared and that we can do that. And as I think Noel would agree, if we screw this up, shame on us.
That seems to be
Hey,
the
Julian,
trend historically, right? Like during the financial crisis, that was the moment that the rail industry decided to reinvest, and rail became much cheaper. So excellent time to get rid of past dependencies. Noel, you were gonna mention something?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, I wholeheartedly agree with what Weston just said. And I think for those, congressional staffers that are on the line, the goods movement as an industry is the economy in motion, right? When you consider how many jobs we generate, when you consider the positive impact of the economy, I mean, there are very few industries that prop up our economy like this. And so to the extent that we want to focus on strategies to recover the U.S. economy, please don't forget about goods movement. Don't forget about transportation, because that's what creates jobs. That's what supports local, the statewide, and the national economies. And then the other thing I would add is, competitiveness. Prior to this coronavirus situation here on the West Coast, specifically in Southern California, it's all about competitiveness. It's all about making sure that we get the cargo to come here. And so I just want to emphasize the point that Weston just made.
So there's some electricity going on here. The staffer from Senator Ron Johnson's office, who's assigned to trade and technology, is asking, Congress is considering including an infrastructure package with future coronavirus package. Thoughts on what transportation industry needs infrastructure-wise? How has the answer to that question changed from coronavirus? And this type of package, if it happens at all, would likely happen later in the year, around late June or early July, once things have started to return back to normal. What do you think of those two questions?
Yeah, well,
I think those questions, Julian, are spot on, right? If Congress is envisioning a recovery that is long-term and sustainable, I think investments in infrastructure is a way to get there, right? Why? Because they generate jobs immediately. And the transportation that's developed is going to support even more cargo, which will generate more jobs in the future. So I would certainly support and advocate for transportation infrastructure investments being part of any stimulus package.
Yeah, and I think that one of the efforts that West Coast ports, especially the larger ports, I think in the nation, have tried to undertake is recalculating the formula for harbor maintenance tax and what you can use harbor maintenance tax for. And I think it's a great time to look at that and make sure that the large ports, what we call the donor ports, are getting their fair share of the tax back, so they can work to prepare themselves, make sure that they're in the best situations possible to handle the types of surges that come after these types of issues. And so I would highly recommend reaching out to the Port of Long Beach, Los Angeles, the other large gateways to redefine maybe what we can use harbor, who gets harbor maintenance tax and how that's allocated, but what do we use it for? Because I think having access to that for the land side, not just to use it on the shore side for dredging and for berths, but how do we improve the land side infrastructure that makes that work more efficiently? Taking a big ship is great, but if you can't move the cargo in an efficient manner because the land side infrastructure pales in comparison to what you've done on the water side, you're going to have challenges. And so I would highly encourage, as any part of an infrastructure bill, to take a look at harbor maintenance tax and work with the fine folks at these donor ports to make sure that they have what they need to prepare for the next challenge that we deal with. And I know that the Port of Long Beach has done an excellent job in investing on dock rail. We look at opportunities inland, like the Utah Inland Port Authority, which may be able to do short haul rail from our West Coast ports to Salt Lake City, which could be a good thing for our truckers as well. And moving some of the truck traffic out of a major metropolitan area like LA Long Beach, at the same time growing the ports. And so we need to look at these opportunities moving forward and make sure we're not just maintaining what we have, but we're setting ourselves up for future success.
So we've got one last question. And before that, I'm going to add a little commercial real quick. Guys, if you've been valuing this question, I encourage you to stay active on the COVID Response Network, which is our special project for everything related to how folks can navigate this current issue. And of course, come to our conference in October. But the last question, and then we'll sign off, is what's keeping you both up at night? That's from Elena Asher. Weston? No, I'll start with Noel, but he may need to go. I just got a note. But Weston, if that's all right with you?
No, I defer to Noel first.
Okay.
You know, these days we're not getting a lot of sleep, but obviously what is first and foremost on our mind is the health and safety of all of our employees, right? Both internally here at the Port Authority, as well as all our dock workers, our truck drivers, and everyone in between. We want to make sure that we all come out of this situation healthy, safe, secure. And again, I'm an eternal optimist. You know, I'm really hopeful that all of us will leverage this crisis and come out of this crisis more collaborative, with the bigger picture in mind, and working together to come out of this and help prop up our economy. And the last thing I'll say is, on the screen, you'll see a page on our website that's dedicated to COVID-19. It's an excellent source of information, data, a lot of the data I shared earlier that's available to all the listeners. And it's right there, POLB.com/COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Noel. And Weston?
Well, I've been trying to get as much sleep as possible. So I'm my melatonin. I have a baby due in 5 weeks, so I need to catch up on sleep now. But I would say this, in all honesty, there's two things that we think about. First is the immediate. It's the health, it's the safety, it's the well-being of a workforce. And what can we do to ensure that we're taking all the proper measures to get supplies in their hand, to reduce any sort of standard operating procedures that may put them at risk. And again, doing everything we can to work with other partners to make sure that we're doing all of our parts to keep folks safe and healthy. I think the other thing that keeps me up at night, if you will, is preparing for that long-term recovery. And what does that look like? And how do we minimize impacts to the people of this nation to make sure that if they were affected because they were furloughed or laid off, that we're getting them back to work. We're making sure that they're in a better place than they were before this started. But for me, again, I'm like Noel, I'm an optimist, but I look forward to the challenge. I got to tell you, I come in to work, quote unquote, every day in a virtual sense now, but and I look forward to what can I do to help this initiative, and what can I do to help make this situation easier for somebody else. And that to me it's an opportunity. And I think if we all look at this in the same way, not what are we afraid of, but what can we do to make it better, we'll come out of this stronger on the back end. And that's why, you know, maybe I have been sleeping well, is because this is a great opportunity to show why America is the greatest nation. And what can we do to ensure that that is the situation for years and decades and centuries to come.
And this is what makes you both excellent gentlemen. Thank you so much for your insights, the wealth and benefit of your experience, everything that you see on a daily basis, and your partnership with Get Global and now the COVID Response Network that we've launched. I know that we're already starting to get fabulous feedback, and I know that there are a lot of people who were helped by this information. And I hope that we can check in with you in the near future to have an update and see how things progress. Thank you again, and I'll be in touch with you. To everybody who's on the line right now, we're going to post this on YouTube later, just in case you missed it or wanted to go back and reference something. And at the same time, please do keep involved with the COVID Response Network, because we've got all kinds of information. It's multidisciplinary, fully global in its scope and reach. So pose questions, start discussions, reach out to folks. There's some amazing people on there, great brands, great resources, folks in government. We just passed the 300 member mark. So dive in and see who's there, okay? And we'll be back with more. Well, we've got a personal branding and influencer session later today at 11 a.m. And then we've got a ton of programming coming up next week that I think you'll all find very valuable. So thanks again. I will talk to you both soon. Weston, Noel, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone.